And the Americans, and maybe all people, not just Americans, but Americans have that burning and yearning that at some point they're just not going to take it anymore. They say enough. And that doesn't mean I'm going to go to the Capitol. It doesn't mean I'm going to do this or that, but we need to take stock in what we can do.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are very excited and happy to have John Brian Eleazer, author of the South Carolina Militia in the Revolutionary War, Captain Henry Felder, and the Backcountry Defense. So welcome, Brian.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share this new book that just came out last week. It's the South Carolina Militia during the Revolutionary War and the defense of the backcountry. A little about me: I'm a native South Carolinian. I was raised in the central part of this state where there was a lot of ancestors that confronted tyranny. I presently live in Mount Pleasant, and American history, especially early American history, has never been really far from me. At a very early age, my mother told me about an ancestor who was in the American Revolution, which was interesting, and then she told me that he was killed wearing a lady's dress while he was fleeing his cabin. Now, as a young boy, that's something you just never forget. And about 15 years ago, when my mother died, I inherited a lot of her files as far as she was the collector of family history and family lore, as most families have at least one person who collects all these things and passes them on. So I started going through my mother's stuff, and I was wrapping down my military career and working. So this project started about 15 years ago when I started writing heavily. I exhausted libraries. I exhausted the archives that I knew about, especially the one in Orangeburg, the Orangeburg Historical Society. And I just want to say, the librarians and archive people are just tremendous people, and always thank them because they do tireless work, and they have always been friendly to me. But I started collecting a lot of information, and then I actually went to antique stores to find old history books that sit on a shelf that nobody apparently wants, or I went to online to find books that were out of print, but they're print on demand. And I started collecting a pretty vast library. And there's a couple of things that happen pretty quickly. You fall yourself in an abyss, if you will. There are very few films and books on the Revolutionary War. I'll challenge you to come up with 10 films, and we'll probably run out at around 8. And then books, you're going to find most books are about some of our founding fathers, some of the military leaders like maybe Sumter or Marion or Nathaniel Greene. But if you go to the library or if you go to a bookstore, you're not going to find many that talk about the militia other than some footnotes. You'll read a little bit about the Northern Campaign with George Washington, but you're not going to read a whole lot about the South. And then the other thing that happened, and while this started looking at my ancestor more like a genealogy study, an exercise with a little bit of extra content, it quickly changed focus. Because as I dug into this, I found a lot of information about the South Carolina Militia, these men and women who suffered and sacrificed and are somewhat dismissed or not written about other than maybe a footnote and an occasional article. And the other thing is the sources. I collected a lot of sources, and if you do a deep dive into anything, you're going to find inconsistencies on dates, locations, regiments. But I didn't get too wound up on that. And the other thing is events. It's, to me, if I don't study what came before the event, during the event, and the aftermath, then you kind of miss what happened in that event. And so I built a timeline and a spreadsheet of over 500 events during the American Revolution, most of which were in the Southern Campaign. So that leads to the fact that there was some 200 or so skirmishes or special events that happened in South Carolina. Another thing you'll quickly find is dismissive comments about the militia, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I leaned heavily on material from the 1800s and the early 1900s of some of our great historians who focused mostly on copious notes and narratives about the Revolutionary War. I'm talking about people like Edward McCready, David Ramsey, Gilmore Simms, Yates Snowden. They all had their own style. But I leaned heavily on that, and then I backtracked with messages and reports from the field, memoirs, and recent material. And recent material is great because when I dig into a recent piece of material, I'm reading the information, and all authors have heroes that they talk a lot about, and I don't get bogged down in that because I have a hero here too, so that's fine. But the knowledge, the assessment of a battle possibly, and then the sources and footnotes. I'm nutty about that. I really dig into the sources because I'll find sources that I have not run across yet, and that's something I needed to do. And this kind of circles around why I wrote this. And as I mentioned, the suffering and the sacrifices of the South Carolina Militia, that very little has been written about, really drove me into this study. And one of the things is there's so many accomplishments and things that happened in South Carolina during that time. It's almost like it's a number thing. You want to say, did you know? And did you know that 20 or 30% of the American war casualties occurred in this state? And normally this doesn't count the militiamen because the militiamen numbers and the casualties are not reported very often. And as I mentioned, there was 200 skirmishes and critical events here, which is a very large number. And then after the fall of Charlestown in May of 1780, the militia was a lone resistance here in this state for the better part of the next 2 years, with a few exceptions, and they were great exceptions. But the militia was the forefront with people like Sumter and Marion and Pickens. And the exceptions were William Washington, who I always thought was a godsend. His cavalry coming down here took on Tarleton and was very persistent about it. And then we know about Henry Lee, who came down and predominantly fought with Marion, and he was a great exception. And then we had Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan came down at Cowpens, and a lot of people know about that battle. And that was a very important moment for us between Cowpens and Kings Mountain that occurred. That was kind of a turning point. But everywhere in between, it was mostly led up to this lone resistant militia. And then you can ask yourself, why did they do that, and what do we know about them? They fought for the better part of 7.5 to 8 years. It was persistent. And I believe, as I wrote in the book, it started with the foundation of the backcountry. One of the unusual things that I found real quickly was that South Carolina had a bunch of planned settlements across South Carolina, and they had a lot of strong leaders from the get-go. They had common hardships such as the Cherokee Indian, the French and Indian Wars, and then we had a regulator movement where some leaders took it upon themselves to dismiss judgment and stuff, which put them on a collision course with Charlestown. And this was very important because in the coming years, Charlestown and the backcountry, while they had turmoil and ran into each other in beliefs, the backcountry had a lot of courageous leaders, even from the beginning, who found a way to resolve difficulties in this very young government, creating a judicial circuit court, as well as being represented in the early South Carolina government, and the all of South Carolina came together. So they found a way to come together, which established, I think, a foundation which served South Carolina well as we got into the war and stuff, and the genesis of our early government here. Now, right before the Revolutionary War, there was a couple of the coming years. There was a lot of activity going on. South Carolina had their own version of the Liberty Boys. They had their own Liberty Tree. We had our own tea parties down here. Some people don't know that. And the backcountry was involved in all of these. And then we had the travels of William Tennant and William Henry Drayton, who went into the backcountry to talk to people, understand the settlements and the sentiments toward a coming war. and that was very important. One of the interesting notes that I had is he traveled up the Congaree River and the Broad River, and he may just have actually had a meeting at one of my ancestors on my dad's side. A guy named John Eleazer had a tavern up in that area, and there's a good chance that actually William Henry Drayton actually held a meeting there, and that tavern still is, the structure is still in existence up near Chapin. At the same time, we had a readiness of war. We had gunpowder making, which my ancestor Henry Felder was involved in. The earliest militias were being formed, and we had something called a Continental Association, which was a boycott. And when we decided to enforce the boycott, we had to find out that all the other settlements and leaders were going to honor that and boycott British goods. And that was another reason why the militia started coming out. During this same time, Britain had somewhat abandoned South Carolina as a form of government, and South Carolina was forming its own government and actually had a constitution as a temporary constitution in March of 1776. We formed our own government and independence at that point because Britain had left. So what's interesting about that is a lot of our founding fathers in South Carolina and Charleston, such as like John Rutledge and his brother Edward, did not believe we could have a separate government from Britain. They had stated so in the Continental Congress earlier. And so a lot of people were not on board in the direction we were going. So William Henry Drayton now promoted him as Chief Justice of South Carolina, actually charged several district grand juries to look into, does South Carolina have a right to have its own independent government? And that's again where Henry Felder, my ancestor, was involved, but he wasn't alone. If I told Henry Felder's story, it's the same story of a lot of other militiamen that were engaging much early. But one of the interesting things that I found was Henry Felder wrote a document called the Address and Declaration, also referred to as the Orangeburg Declaration. And within this document, he wrote that whilst engaged in an arduous but glorious struggle for the perseverance of those invaluable rights and liberty, which by the law of reason and nature all men have a right to possess, and without the possession of which life itself would be a burden, we declare that we most heartily do approve of, we are determined with our lives and fortunes to support and maintain and defend it. And this was in May of 1776. Which is interesting because the grand jury's words, where Henry Felder was the foreman, took the same language of John Locke, a great philosopher on individuals and inalienable rights, and it also preceded by couple of months of what Thomas Jefferson would write in our Declaration of Independence afterwards. So I know our family and ancestors are quite proud that Henry Felder and his grand jury was one of the first to write a document of sort. Then we move into the next chapter where we had the militia involved in a lot of conflicts early. And this also showed the militia somewhat engaged. We had what happened at Fort Sullivan and at the fort of the Palmetto Logs, but some people don't know of what Colonel William Thompson Rangers and the militia did at the breach, because the British had felt that they were going to come to the fort by land and landed on the Long Island, Isle of Palms today, and crossed that breach and approached the fort by land. There was some 200 to 300 militiamen at the breach, as well as the Rangers, as well as Thomas Sumter. We have Thomas Sumter and his regiment of rifles were there as well, which was really a wonderful thing, because what happened was Clinton and his men tried to cross the breach, and we all know that it's pretty rapid there. I think the distance was more like a mile at the time, and they tried to cross on rafts and stuff. But every attack that they tried to make, they were fronted with the riflemen and the grape shot from cannons, and that was a complete failed attempt. But that was one of our first engagement of warfare. Soon after that, we had the siege of Savannah, where General Lincoln of the Patriots decided to go and re-seize Savannah. as he was doing something, a general named Provost, a British General Provost, decided to sidestep what Lincoln was doing and come toward Charleston. And there's a lot of action there because a lot of the militia at that time was sent over to General Moultrie, and he tried to he threw all the militia he could against him to slow that advance of Provost until Lincoln sent enough men to have the British turn around. So then we come to the siege of Savannah, which was one of the worst tragedies and the loss of life during the early part of the war. Lincoln had a lot of militiamen that he did still have, as well as the Continental Line. I believe John Lawrence was there. Tried to march across and attack about 200 yards or 300 yards of open terrain, and they were laid down quite severely, and that was a tremendous loss. And then once Savannah was secured by the British, they decided to march on to Charleston. And a lot of us know the story of Charleston, and it fell in May. And then shortly after that, on a personal note, we lost Henry Felder. He was killed by the Loyalists in February 1780. So in those few months of 1780, we had three major events that happened in South Carolina, which threw South Carolina in a desperate time. And the militia was all we had here. But for whatever the reason, and this is where I think of the comment, the phrase we hear today, mess around and you'll find out. Well, the British messed around and found out. One of the first things they did was they massacred Buford's troops in Waxhaw. He also went after Thomas Sumter, who had retired from the military at this point, but was living around where Sumter is today. And his troops went to go arrest Thomas Sumter and found him not there. He, I think, burned his house. I think they assaulted his wife. And all that did was just light Thomas Sumter up. And he was one of our great leaders. Marion at that time was nursing a broken ankle, I believe. And so he was still about. And so we moved into that section of the American Revolution. So after the fall of Charleston, I want to bring up who this militia was. A lot of comments have been made about the South Carolina Militia. We know that some historians have been pretty, they downplayed the South Carolina Militia quite a bit. One author, Michael Scoggins, wrote in his epilogue, he said, historians have often downplayed and even maligned the performance and the usefulness of the militia during the American Revolution, despite their many accomplishments and victories. Other great leaders, as George Washington and Nathaniel Greene, had very dismissive things to say about the South Carolina, so their record is not really pretty in some books and things. And I felt that I needed to write and address some of these head-on. I'm not going to re-quote what these great leaders said about the militia, but I will say that if you take these quotes, you need to think about what was going on at the time when they made the quotes and what their thoughts were on military knowledge as far as how to fight a war. And it's fair to consider all these comments that they made during the time. George Washington's most critical comments were made after he had to flee New York. A lot of militiamen and the people he had, the army he had, enlistments were turning up. He felt that he always needed a large army to combat the British. He felt that there was going to be one major battle up in the Hudson River area, and that was his focus. And he did not have the men, and he would never have the men that he would like to confront the British. And so he was somewhat disappointed, and he couldn't fight the way that he was initially wanting to fight the war. Another item was Nathaniel Greene made comments a lot. He didn't think much of the skirmishes we were having down here in the South. He also felt that he needed a large army and really needed a very large cavalry. You would go through history and see where he continuously asked General Marion and General Sumter for cavalry horses and good mounted horses, which Sumter and Marion may have given him some, but Nathaniel Greene never realized the cavalry he really wanted to fight down here. So it's fair that if you take those comments, you need to think of where they came from. But in fairness, George Washington was not always critical of the militia. His battle in Springfield was saved mainly by riflemen at a river that kept the British from crossing. And he made a comment that said, "They flew in arms universally and acted in the spirit equal to anything I've ever seen in the course of war." So I'm trying to be a little fair to George Washington. When he did see heroics on the battlefield, he stated so. And so who were the South Carolina Militia? Well, one of the things is the South Carolina Militia were not necessarily professional soldiers in the beginning. But I would say by 1780 and 1781, they had more than enough experience, much like a football player or a rookie on a team. By the time the end of the season comes around in bowl games, they are not rookies anymore. They're somewhat experienced. Another thing about the South Carolina Militia, they seldom left South Carolina. Other than the early part of the war, when they went into Georgia and Florida once, they were defending on their own home turf. And they knew their home turf, because this is one of the uniquenesses about the South Carolina Militia and South Carolina itself. The geography of South Carolina is not like any other colony. We have a tremendous number of rivers and swamps, and armies down here did not move very well unless they knew the geography. Another thing is, because they were on their home turf, they needed the sentiments of the communities in the area. And so therefore they could forage, or they could avoid areas that were hotbeds for loyalists. This is something General Gates overlooked when he came to Camden. He tried to come straight down into Camden and fight a war in the very hot sun. He had dispatched the militias to the left and the right of him, and he did not find pickings for foraging and feeding the troops very good. And so when he came down there, it was a real tragedy of the war. And the militiamen were normally older. Some of these men had fought in the French and Indian War or the Cherokee War for years and years, and they came with what was on their back, which a lot of them carried Pennsylvania long rifles or long rifles of some. I'm not going to say all militiamen had the long rifle, but quite a number of them did, and they populated like Thomas Sumter's rifle brigade, as well as the Orangeburg Militia had a lot of rifles involved, as we know at the Battle of the Breach that I mentioned earlier. And so the rifle and the musket are absolutely two different weapons. Sometimes we overlook that, but a rifle could be accurate at 300 yards. I would say most of the militiamen could hit their target at 200 yards. 300 is maybe a stretch, but they could hit it at 200 yards. Whereas a musket may be accurate to 100 yards, most likely 50 yards. But the downfall of the rifle would be reloading. Reloading would take maybe a full minute or 2 or 3 times in 3 minutes, where a musket could be reloaded 2 or 3 times in a minute. Rifles also were more expensive, and I would say the leaders of our armies did not necessarily know how to use a rifle in combat or how to deploy them. One of the great exceptions were during the Saratoga War, where Daniel Morgan used infantry with bayonets to escort his riflemen at the Battle of Saratoga, which was known for shooting and killing General Fraser at 300 yards. And that was on the left flank, or the British right flank. And when Fraser died, his troops became in a total disarray. We find the same thing at Cowpens, where Daniel Morgan once again used riflemen. He deployed them very smartly. He was able to take out a lot of Tarleton's men and officers and leaders early part of the engagement at the Cowpens, which made it very hard for Tarleton to reorganize his army to fight. Another thing is that I wanted to mention is the other battles where the rifle was very important. I mentioned the Breach. I mentioned Saratoga. Sumter used them quite effectively at Blackstock Plantation, where he put Hampton's riflemen in the center in buildings, and Tarleton once again charged, much like he did in Cowpens, and he lost a lot of officers in the very early part of that battle. And so the militiamen were somewhat different. And some people go back and they'll look at that a lot of the South Carolina War battles were skirmishes. And some people may want to overlook a skirmish by saying it's not a major battle or a major war or loss of life. But I want to close by talking about what British historian and philosopher Sir Edmund Burke said in 1781 and 1782 about these skirmishes in South Carolina. He was writing predominantly about the skirmishes in South Carolina when he made this quote in the Register in London. Most of these actions would in other wars be considered as skirmishes of little account and scarcely worthy of a detailed narrative. But these small strokes are as capable as any displaying military conduct. The operation of the war being spread over this vast continent by a new plan that was adopted, if is by such skirmishes that the fate of America must be necessarily decided. They are therefore as important as a battle in which 100,000 are lined up and drawn up on each side. So, around much earlier, Nathaniel Greene had made a comment about partisan strokes, and they reap little benefit. The British didn't feel that way. And so, as far as independent conclusions, to me, are inescapable. The war simply would not have been won without the militia and each volunteer individual's conviction and sacrifice. Like for many South Carolinians, the Carolina Militia and Henry Felder and his sons did not seek recognitions. They had much earlier adopted this country and more than willing to fight for all of it. As Governor John Rutledge noted in the movie All for Liberty, it was then I began to think it was these people, the ones you never heard of, the ones you may never know. There's no statues to honor them, no monuments, but without them, where would we be? I could only talk of liberty. They were willing to die for it. So my book is covers this foundation, the early wars and the turmoil and the rise of the backcountry militia.
That is fantastic. So where can people get your book?
My book is on Amazon's site, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and if you just search on the words or my name, it's on a lot of bookstore sites online.
Well, great. As I listened to you, I couldn't help but think that the militia and their role at Ramsers Mill to put down the loyalist militia in that area as the British were coming up through South Carolina. Huck's defeat was a huge militia win and they took care of Christian Huck, which was a captain of the dragoons under Tarleton. Hanging Rock, where Thomas Sumter said, had we had one Continental officer here, it would be looked on as one of the best battles from the Patriot standpoint. We got, and there they took care of North Carolina Colonel Bryan, who was a loyalist from the North Carolina region. But they also, the Prince of Wales division, they actually turned them into a non-fighting force. They couldn't field a full force after that. Fish Dam Ford, where Sumter's militia took care of Major Weems, which was another cavalry officer for the British that they relied on. And, of course, you mentioned Blackstocks, where they actually took care of Tarleton or gave Tarleton one of his big defeats.
Yeah,
These are all militia. These were all militia victories, not continental victories. So kudos to you in writing this book. Kudos to you in your research. And I'm sure that people will enjoy the book when they pick it up and learn and understand more how the everyday citizen soldier stood up against tyranny, stood up against a country that was wanting to take their rights away, and were willing to draw a line in the sand of what those rights were and what they would do for those. So that brings me to my next question. Brian, what does liberty mean to you?
Well, let me, if I may, you were mentioning a lot of battles that were just the militia and the militia won. There is one particular battle that stands out. To a lot of people, it's very controversial, and exactly what happened there, I still study and I still look into, but it was very, very important because it was only by the militia. And that was the Battle of Quinby Bridge and Schubert's Plantation. This is where the militia, maybe one of the first time, was clearly the militia engaged, and Henry Lawrence was with him as well. And the outcome of that battle, we'll let people debate, because there's a lot of, like I said, there's different opinions on that. But if I might, I want to read two quotes from historians who thought about the turning point and a big moment in the South Carolina militia. The first one is from Edward McCready, who wrote in 1902 about this particular battle. He said, "The British interest was materially shaken, their party alarmed and humbled. The spirit of the South Carolina militia raised, and the fact was announced to the world that this country was not conquered." And then William Johnson, in Sketches and Correspondence of Nathaniel Greene, wrote this in 1822. He said, "Perhaps the greatest benefit that resulted from this expedition was the confidence with which it inspired the militia itself. The party actually engaged in an attack of British Colonel Coates were almost exclusively the South Carolina militia, and their bravery and what they displayed would have done honor to the veteran troops. It was demonstrated that this species of force wanted nothing but the consistency to enable it to meet the enemy with effects. The terror of the British bayonet and the British discipline began to diminish, whilst the respect of the enemy for their undisciplined valor rode in proportions." I mean, to me, that really stands out to me.
It certainly does. And I was remiss by not mentioning Kings Mountain, which is perhaps one of the pinnacles for militia coming in. I think Cornwallis even said it was he talked to him about an invisible army. He said he didn't know anything about them, and they came in riding horses. And that wasn't necessarily true, but it goes to what the militia could put up and how fierce they could fight.
And so you asked me what liberty means.
Yeah. Let's get back to that.
Well, in the 1700s, in most of the people's lives were somewhat predetermined. Class, society, vocation, and everything. They couldn't really change their destiny in so many ways. So in America, what does liberty mean? And it means the freedom to pursue an individual self-reliance. I think it's the flame that burns in Americans' bosom that knows that with sacrifice and effort, we can achieve, whatever your passion and your driven purpose is. We have endless opportunities based on our own sweat and sacrifice, and can rise above any challenge. And liberty and freedom that we have here is, allows us to have that. That's what the American dream is. And liberty enables this. And that's what it means to me.
I've got to ask you a question that I haven't asked everybody else. We were talking at one of the 250th commission meetings the other day, and they were talking about a poll that they did on younger generation, and better part of 60% to 70%, and maybe even more, I don't remember the actual numbers, but it was certainly an overwhelming majority of those polled favored dictatorship and not the republic that we live in. What's your thoughts on that?
We're inundated by a lot of sources, and maybe the internet is one of those things that helps and hurts us. And like artificial intelligence, which I actually know a little bit about, those things make it so easy for us to even do research, such as what I did. And we don't interrogate facts and evidence like we used to in our brain. Not that we want to argue people, but when you hear something, we go, well, how do you know that? And I want to know more. And at times we get things so easily that we get a little lazy. And as Representative Floyd Spence told me once, and Thomas Paine wrote it in his Common Sense, and that is, nothing of value is easily obtained because it's not lasting if you're not willing to fight for it. And so we don't fight for knowledge and understanding like we once did. And maybe there's people out there who feel like they need to be told to do what to do and stuff, and they kind of lose their way. They're demotivated possibly because things are just so easy for them. But tyranny will always rise its head. It continually comes at us. And I think I even made a comment in the book about that tyranny will always raise its head and challenge us. And the Americans, and maybe all people, not just Americans, but Americans have that burning and yearning that at some point they're just not going to take it anymore. They say enough. And that doesn't mean I'm going to go to the Capitol. It doesn't mean I'm going to do this or that, but we need to take stock in what we can do. And I think what we have in the South Carolina 250th, we have an opportunity to bring the militia and their accomplishments and what happened in this particular state back to the forefront. Because South Carolina has an awful lot of people here that can track their genealogy right back to the 1700s. And they may know little or fragmented knowledge of what their own ancestors did. And we need to rekindle that and be proud of the blood that we share, that flow through us. Sorry, I didn't mean to get long on that.
No, that's good. The book is The South Carolina Militia in the Revolutionary War, Captain Henry Felder and the Backcountry Defense. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.